The wind off the high plains was already shrieking sideways through the gaps in the lodge windows when the lamps guttered out, and 43 guests in their borrowed evening wool turned toward each other in the dark and began, almost in unison, to scream. Not the cowboys. The cowboys stood frozen at the long bar with their hats in their hands because none of them had ever seen a blizzard come in this fast in October, and none of them knew what to do with 43 terrified tourists in a building whose generator had just been ripped open by a falling cottonwood. The owner of the lodge, a man 6 feet and 4 inches of weathered silence, was halfway across the great room with a kerosene lantern in his fist when the heavy plus-size seamstress, in the worn brown traveling dress, the one most of the room had spent the last 6 weeks pretending not to see, simply stepped past him toward the screaming and lifted both her hands and began to give orders. She told the bartender to move every guest to the south wall. She told the cook to bring every blanket from the laundry room. She told 2 ranch hands to nail her own quilts over the broken windows. She told a sobbing woman in pearls to breathe with her, in for 4, out for 6. She was 31 years old. She weighed nearly 200 pounds. She had walked into this valley with 1 carpet bag and $17 to her name, and not one person in that great room had ever once asked her name out loud. But she stood under the dead chandelier in a dress 2 seasons out of fashion, and she ran that emergency the way a captain runs a ship, and within 20 minutes nobody was screaming anymore, and the owner of the lodge was watching her across the lantern light the way a man watches the only thing in the world he is afraid to lose. If this story moved you already, if you felt something in your chest tighten when that woman stepped forward in a room full of people who had spent weeks looking past her, then I want you to do 3 small things for me before we go any further. Subscribe to this channel and follow her story all the way to the end, because what she does in the next 40 minutes is going to surprise you, and the truth she uncovers about who has been quietly trying to destroy this lodge is going to surprise you more. Stay with me through to the final scene. Do not click away, because the ending of this story turns on a single sentence spoken out loud by a man who never thought he would say it in front of witnesses. And drop the name of your town in the comments below. Just your town, because I am genuinely curious how far this story is going to travel tonight. Now let me take you back 6 weeks to the evening this woman first walked into that valley with nothing in her hands but a carpet bag and a vow she had made to herself on the train. Her name was Hattie Mercer, and she had been walking since the stagecoach had broken its axle 9 miles outside of Cottonwood Bend, Wyoming, on the last Friday in August of 1889. The driver had unloaded what trunks he could and told the 4 passengers they could either wait by the road or walk, and the 2 men had taken the only 2 horses, and the other woman, a thin schoolteacher bound for Sheridan, had begun to cry, and Hattie had simply picked up her carpet bag and started walking. She was 31 years old. She was wider through the hips and shoulders than the dress catalogs in Chicago liked to admit a woman could decently be. She had lost her mother to the influenza in March and her father to the bottle 2 weeks after that, and the small dressmaking shop on Halsted Street that had been the only home she had ever known had been sold at auction in June to pay off her father's debts. And after the auctioneer's hammer had come down, she had counted out the $17.40 the bank had returned to her, and she had bought a one-way ticket on the cheapest line west because there was nothing left in Illinois that knew her name. In a kindly tone, she had made herself a promise on the train somewhere between Omaha and Cheyenne, with her forehead pressed against the cold glass and the prairie sliding past in the dark. She had promised herself that she would never again hope for a soft landing, never again expect a single human being to look at her and see anything other than a heavy plain woman past the age when men chose women, and never under any circumstance allow herself to believe that any place she set foot in was going to be a home. She had said the words aloud into the glass, and the glass had not argued with her, and that had felt, at the time, like an agreement. So when she came down off the rise at dusk and saw the lights of Cottonwood Bend strung out below her in the bowl of the valley, and beyond the town, the long, low silhouette of a timber lodge with 2 stone chimneys throwing white smoke up against a sky the color of a bruised peach, she did not let her chest lift, even a little. She counted her steps the rest of the way down the road. 240 steps to the edge of town, 60 more to the wooden boardwalk, 22 to the door of the only establishment, with a hand-lettered sign in the window that read, "Help wanted, inquire within, no experience necessary," and underneath, in smaller letters, "Women welcome, fair wages." The sign was tacked to the front door of a place called the Wide Sky Lodge, and the man who opened the door to her knock was the tallest man she had ever seen up close, and he did not smile when he saw her, and he did not frown either, and that was the first thing about Caleb Roan that Hattie Mercer learned. He looked at her face. He did not look at her body. He looked at her face like he was reading a page of small print, and then he stepped back and said, "Come inside, out of the wind. You look like you walked here," she told him. She had. He nodded once, and that was all he said for the next 4 minutes, while he led her through a great room with exposed timber rafters and a hearth wide enough to roast a yearling in, past a long oak bar that had been polished so many times the grain had gone soft as suede, and into a small office in the back where he poured her a tin cup of coffee and pushed it across the desk to her, and finally sat down opposite. "What can you do?" he said. She said, "I can sew." He waited. She said, "I can sew anything. Curtains, ticking, shirts, breeches, ladies' dresses, men's coats, saddle pads, gun cases, oilcloth covers for hay bales, canvas for tents, sheets, pillow shams, table linen. I can take a torn boot upper and make it look like the boot was born that way. I can cut a pattern from a man's shoulders by eye in under a minute. I worked my mother's shop on Halsted Street for 15 years, and I ran it for the last 6 on my own, and I am not asking for charity. I am asking for a place to lay my head and a fair wage for a fair day's work." He did not answer for what felt like a long time. He looked at her hands, which she had folded on the desk in front of her without thinking about it, and he looked at the calluses along the sides of her index fingers, where the needles had ridden for years, and he looked back up at her face. He said, "The lodge is failing." She blinked. He said it again, level as if he were stating the weather. "The Wide Sky Lodge is failing. We have lost 3 guides and a cook in the last 4 months. Our linens are coming back from the laundry in worse shape than they leave. The roof over the west wing leaks, and the carpenter in town will not return my letters. We host hunting parties from back east. Gentlemen who pay $40 a week to shoot elk, and pretend they are explorers, and last month 2 of them complained loudly enough in a Denver newspaper that I now have 3 cancellations on my books for September and 4 for October. I cannot pay what a real seamstress is worth. I can pay you $1 a day and a private room and 3 meals, and I can offer you my word that no man under this roof will lay a hand on you or speak a word out of line in your hearing, and if one does, I will put him on the road myself before sundown. That is what I have to offer." He waited. She counted to 5 inside her head, which was a thing she did when she was afraid she might cry and did not want to. She said, "I will take it." He nodded. Once he stood up. He said, "Supper is at 7, breakfast at 5:30. Your room is the second door at the top of the back stairs. The key is in the lock, and the lock works. Nobody comes through that door without your permission, including me." She felt something in her throat go tight, and she did not let it show on her face, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Rowan," he said. "Caleb is fine." And then he was gone, and she sat alone in the small office, with the tin cup of coffee going cold between her palms, and she thought, do not let yourself, you promised." The room he gave her was small and clean, and smelled faintly of cedar from the chest at the foot of the iron bed. There was a window that looked east across the corral toward the long blue ridge of the bighorns, and there was a washstand with a chipped enamel basin, and there was a single ladder-back chair, and on the seat of the chair somebody, presumably Caleb himself, had laid a folded gray wool blanket and a fresh tallow candle and a box of matches and a slip of paper that read in a careful blocky hand, "Hot water in the kitchen kettle, from 5 until 9. Help yourself, no need to ask." She sat down on the edge of the bed and she pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth, and she counted the boards in the floor. There were 14. She counted them twice. She did not cry. She had promised. The first person at the Wide Sky Lodge to speak directly to her, other than Caleb, was a boy of about 17 named Jubal Whitfield, who came knocking at her door the next morning at 5:45, with a basket of mending under one arm and an expression of such open, hopeful anxiety on his sunburnt face that Hattie almost laughed. He said, "Ma'am, Mr. Roan said you was the seamstress, and I got this pile of shirts and breeches that's been waiting on somebody for I don't know how long, and the boy's been wearing them with the tears just flapping because there ain't been nobody to fix them since Miss Della left in May, and I was wondering, ma'am, if it ain't too much trouble, if you might maybe see your way to—" She took the basket from him. She said, "Bring me any other mending in the bunkhouse by noon, and I will have the lot back to you by Tuesday." He stared at her. He said, "All of it." She said, "All of it." He said, "Ma'am, there is a lot of it." She said, "I expect there is." He grinned, then a wide gap-toothed grin, and he tipped the brim of his battered hat to her, and he ran down the stairs 2 at a time, and she heard him hollering across the yard. She said she'd do all of it, and she heard a man's voice answer something she could not make out, and she shut the door, and she sat down at the little table by the window, and she pulled the first torn shirt out of the basket, and she began with the small steel needle she had carried in a tin in her carpet bag from Chicago to mend the lives of strangers. By Tuesday she had returned 37 garments to the bunkhouse, every one of them folded, every tear invisible from a foot away, every missing button replaced, 3 of the heavier work shirts reinforced through the shoulders with a hidden second layer of canvas where the rifle straps had been wearing through. Jubal carried the stack out across the yard with both arms, and called the hands out of the corral to come look, and the older men, 4 of them, came over and lifted the shirts off the top of the pile, and turned them in the morning sun, and ran their thumbs along the seams, and one of them, a weathered, gray-bearded man named Silas Ord, whose face looked like a piece of dry creek bed, looked across the yard to where Hattie was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded, and he tipped his hat to her. He did not smile. He did not speak. He just tipped his hat, a slow, deliberate 2-finger touch to the brim and a half-inch lift, and then he went back to his work. Hattie went back inside the kitchen, and she leaned her forehead against the cool plaster of the wall by the stove, and she counted to 10, and she did not cry, because she had promised. By the end of the first week, she had also rehemmed every tablecloth in the dining room, recovered the seats of all 6 chairs at the head table with a length of dark green wool she found bolted away in a storeroom that nobody seemed to remember buying, repaired the torn canvas awning over the porch, and replaced the dry rotted curtain rings on every window in the great room. She had done all this without being asked. She had simply walked the rooms in the early mornings before the guests came down for breakfast and made a mental list, and then she had worked through the list in the order of what she judged most visible to a paying gentleman from Boston. On the 8th morning, Caleb Roan came into the dining room while she was on a stepladder hanging the last of the recovered curtains, and he stood at the bottom of the ladder with his hat in his hand, and he looked up at her, and he said, "You did not have to do the curtains." She said, "I know." He said, "I cannot pay you extra for them." She said, "I did not ask you to." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The $1 a day is for the mending. Anything else you do for this lodge you tell me, and we will work it out fair. I do not take from people what they do not owe me." She came down off the ladder, one rung at a time, and she stood in front of him, and she said, "Mr. Roan, I am not doing it for extra pay. I am doing it because I sleep here." He looked at her, then the way he had looked at her in the office on the first night, like he was reading small print, and he did not say anything for a long moment, and then he said, "All right." He put his hat back on. He said, "Supper at 7, she said. "I know." He almost smiled. He did not quite, but the corner of his mouth moved, and she watched it move, and she felt the promise she had made to herself on the train shift, very slightly under her ribs, the way a sleeping animal shifts in its sleep. And she counted the windows in the great room until the feeling passed. There were 11. The wary, wounded thing in this story was not at first a person. It was a horse. There was a bay mare in the second stall of the corral barn, a small, compact animal with a white star on her forehead, and a long pale scar running from the corner of her left eye down her cheekbone to the soft hollow of her jaw, and she had been bought, Jubal told Hattie one afternoon, at a sheriff's sale in Buffalo 2 summers ago from a freight outfit that had used her hard and used her cruel, and she had not let a man within arm's reach of her without trying to bite or kick for the better part of a year. And even now she would only suffer Caleb himself to put a hand on her, and even then only on her left side, and only if he hummed under his breath the whole time, and Jubal said it like a confession, like he was admitting his own failure. Hattie listened. She did not say anything that afternoon, but the next morning, before the sun was up, she walked out to the corral barn with a heel of bread in her apron pocket, and she let herself in through the side door, and she did not approach the mare's stall. She simply sat down on an overturned bucket 12 feet away, and she took out her sewing. And she began to hem a length of muslin for a new curtain in the back parlor. She sewed for 40 minutes. She did not look at the mare. She did not speak to the mare. She just sewed, and she hummed under her breath very softly an old song her mother had taught her, a song about a river in Tennessee, and after 38 minutes she heard the soft clop of a hoof shifting in the straw, and after 41 minutes she heard a slow, considered breath being let out of long nostrils. And she did not stop humming, and she did not break the rhythm of the needle. The next morning she did the same thing, and the next. By the 4th morning the mare was standing at the front of her stall with her ears forward, watching Hattie sew, and on the 6th morning Hattie stood up slowly, walked to within 6 feet of the stall door, set the heel of bread down on the top of the half door, and walked back to her bucket without looking. And by the time she sat down again, the bread was gone. She did not tell anyone. She did not tell Caleb. She just kept going out every morning before sunrise with her sewing and her bread, and by the 2nd week of September, the bay mare would come and stand at the half door of her stall and put her muzzle against Hattie's shoulder, very gently, while Hattie hemmed and hummed. And Hattie would reach up without looking and lay her palm flat against the long pale scar on the mare's cheekbone, and the mare would close her eyes. The first time Caleb came out to the barn at sunrise and saw this happening, he stopped in the doorway, and he did not move for a full minute. Hattie heard him stop. She did not turn around. She kept humming. After a long moment she heard him walk away, very quietly, back across the yard. He did not say anything to her about it at breakfast. He did not say anything to her about it for 3 more days. On the 4th day, at supper, he set down his fork and he said, across the long table in front of every hand and every guest, "That mare's name is Juniper, and she has not let a soul lay a hand on that side of her face in 2 years, and I would consider it a kindness if you would keep doing whatever you are doing." The bunkhouse hands all stopped chewing. Jubal stared at Hattie with his mouth open. Silas Ord, the gray-bearded man, looked across the table at her and tipped his fork toward her, which was the closest thing to a salute he gave to any living creature. Hattie said, "I will," and she went back to her supper, and she counted the candles in the wall sconces along the south wall until her face stopped feeling hot. There were 6. The man who first began to suggest with smiling, deniable courtesy that the Wide Sky Lodge might not be a place with a future, came riding up the front drive on a tall gray gelding on the second Thursday in September. His name was Pemberton Hale, and he owned the Silver Pines hunting resort, 11 miles to the south on the other side of the river, and he had, according to Jubal, who told Hattie this in a low, excited voice while she was repinning a curtain, been trying to buy the Wide Sky from Caleb for the better part of a year. Hale was a small, neat man of about 45, with a sandy mustache and a beautifully cut dove-gray coat, and a habit of removing his hat the moment he stepped indoors, and holding it against his chest as though he were perpetually paying respects to a recently deceased. He walked into the great room of the Wide Sky that afternoon as if he were already its landlord, and he greeted the bartender by name, and he greeted Jubal by name, and when his eyes fell on Hattie, standing at the foot of the staircase, with a basket of curtain rings against her hip, he paused for the smallest half-beat. And then he crossed the room toward her, with his hat against his chest and his other hand extended, and he said, "You must be the new seamstress everyone is talking about. What a perfect pleasure. Pemberton Hale, at your service, ma'am." She set the basket down. She wiped her hand on her apron before she took his because her palm was dusty from the rings, and she felt his fingers close around hers with a soft, careful pressure, the pressure of a man who had been taught somewhere expensive how to shake a woman's hand without bruising it, and she felt, underneath the carefulness, the cool damp of a palm that did not work for its living. She said, "Hattie Mercer," he said, "Miss Mercer," charmed. He held her hand half a second longer than was necessary, and then he released it, and he said, "I do hope dear Caleb is treating you decently. This is a hard valley for a lady alone, and the Wide Sky has had between us something of a difficult season. I would hate to see a woman of your evident talents stranded here when the place finally goes under. May I be so bold as to leave you my card? The Silver Pines is always in want of skilled hands, and I pay. Well, I pay considerably more than $1 a day." He had said the $1 a day with a regret in his voice, as if he had been forced into mentioning it by a sense of moral obligation, and Hattie felt the back of her neck go cold under her collar, because there was no possible way Pemberton Hale should have known what Caleb Roan was paying her. And the only people in the building who could have told him were people she had begun to think of, in the unguarded place under her ribs, as her own. She did not take the card. She let him hold it out in the air between them for a beat that was just long enough to be noticed, and then she said, "Mr. Roan is treating me with perfect decency, thank you, and the Wide Sky is not going anywhere as far as I can see. But I will tell him you stopped by." He smiled. His smile did not reach his eyes. He said, of course, only I do worry, you understand, as a friend of the family, as a neighbor, one hears things. And a lady of your situation, well, I only mean to say that the door at the Silver Pines is always open should circumstances here." He slid the card onto the bottom step of the staircase very neatly, as though he were leaving a tip, and he tipped his hat to her, and he walked across the great room and out the front door, and a minute later she heard the soft creak of his saddle leather and the slow, easy clop of the gray gelding moving back down the drive. She picked up the card. It was heavy cream stock with the words Silver Pines Hunting Resort embossed in silver across the top, and his name in copper plate beneath, and on the back, written in pencil in a careful hand, was the number $2.50 a day, a private cottage kitchen privileged. He had written it before he ever walked through the door. She stood at the foot of the staircase with the card in her hand for a long moment, and then she walked it back through the great room and across the yard to the corral barn, and she went into Juniper's stall, and she opened the door of the small iron stove in the tack room, and she dropped the card onto the coals, and she watched the cream paper curl, blacken, and the silver embossing flare and vanish, and she counted the breaths the mare took in the stall behind her until the card was gone. 11 breaths. She did not tell Caleb that Hale had come. She did not need to, as it turned out. Caleb walked into the kitchen at supper that night, and he set his hat on the peg by the door, and he said without turning around, "Pemberton Hale came up the drive this afternoon," the cook said. "He did," Caleb said. "Who did he talk to?" The cook, an enormous, quiet man named Bo, who had cooked on cattle drives for 20 years before his knees gave out, jerked his chin toward Hattie at the long table. Caleb turned. He said, "What did he offer you?" Hattie said, "2.5 a day." "A cottage, kitchen privileges," Caleb said. "What did you say?" she said. "I burned his card in your tack room stove." There was a long, quiet beat, and then from down the table Silas Ord made a sound that was almost a laugh, a single short hey from somewhere deep in his chest. And Bo the cook turned back to his pot with his shoulders shaking, and Jubal stared at Hattie like she had just walked across the surface of a river. And Caleb Roan stood in the doorway with his hand still on the brim of his hat, and he looked at her across the long table in the lamplight, and he said very quietly, "Thank you, Miss Mercer," she said. "Hattie is fine." He almost smiled again. He did not quite. He sat down at the head of the table, and he poured himself a cup of coffee, and he said, "Eat your supper before it goes cold," and that was all. But that night, walking up the back stairs to her room with her candle, she found a small folded square of paper that had been slipped under her door, and when she opened it on the table by the window in the candlelight, she saw that it was a single line in the same careful blocky hand as the note on the chair on the first night, and it read, "If he comes back, you do not have to speak to him at all," and underneath it, in a smaller hand, as though added as an afterthought, "Send Jubal for me." She folded the paper twice. She put it in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, under her mother's old thimble in its tin. She blew out the candle. She lay in the dark, and she counted the boards in the ceiling. There were 19. She did not cry. The first thing went wrong 4 days later. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that could have been an accident. A bolt of fine linen that had been freighted in from Cheyenne for the new dining room curtains was found in the storeroom, soaked through with lamp oil. The whole bolt ruined, $22 worth of cloth, black and slick and stinking. Ba the cook found it when he went in for flour. He stood in the doorway of the storeroom with the bolt in his arms, and his face had gone the color of old ash, because Bo was the only man with a key to that storeroom, besides Caleb himself, and Bo had been in the kitchen from 4 in the morning straight through, and the lamp in the storeroom had not been lit in 3 days. Caleb came. He looked at the cloth. He looked at the lock on the door, which was not broken. He looked at the small window high in the back wall of the storeroom, which had been propped open about 3 inches, with a folded shim of pine. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Bo, you did not do this." Bo said, "No, sir." Caleb said, "I know you did not." He said it loud enough that Jubal in the next room heard it, and he said it again louder still as he walked back through the kitchen, so every hand in the building would hear. Bo did not do this. Then he went into his office and he shut the door, and he did not come out for 2 hours, and when he came out he had a small leather-bound notebook in his hand that Hattie had never seen before, and he sat down at the long table in the kitchen across from Bo, and he said, "Tell me again exactly what you saw," and he wrote it down. He wrote down the time, the position of the bolt, the smell of the oil, the angle of the propped window, the fact that the lock was not broken. He drew a small sketch of the storeroom. He asked Bo 3 times whether Bo had seen anyone near the back of the lodge that morning. Bo said, "Only the boy from the feed store with the oats, and Pemberton Hale's foreman riding by on the river road around sunup." Caleb wrote that down too. He closed the notebook. He said, "Nobody outside this room talks about this. Not the hands, not the guests, nobody." He looked across the table at Hattie, who had been standing in the doorway with a basin of warm water in her hands the whole time, and he said, "Miss Mercer, that includes you." She nodded. He said, "Also, Hattie, I am sorry about the linen." "I know you had plans for it," she said. "I have other plans. I can do the curtains, in the heavy unbleached muslin from the back parlor, take the green wool off the head chairs, and use it for sashes. It will look richer than the linen would have. Give me a week." He looked at her across the table, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it had done at the bottom of the curtain ladder, the almost smile that did not quite arrive, and he said, "A week." Then he stood up. He put the notebook in the inner pocket of his coat. He walked out into the yard, and he did not say anything else about it for the rest of the day, but Hattie noticed when she went up the back stairs that night that he had added a second hasp and padlock to the storeroom door, and that the high back window had been nailed shut. The second thing went wrong 8 days after that. A guest, a heavy-set gentleman from Philadelphia, named Mr. Biz, Edgar Thorne, who had come for the elk hunting and had been on 3 previous trips to the wide sky, and considered himself something of a friend of the establishment, was helped down off his horse at the end of the second day's hunt, with his face the color of skim milk, and he stood swaying in the yard with one hand braced on the saddle horn, and he said, My flask had a queer taste this afternoon." And then he sat down hard in the dust of the yard, and he vomited until there was nothing left in him, and Caleb carried him into the lodge in his own arms like a child. And Hattie went with them up the stairs to Mr. Thorne's room, because she had been in the great room when they came in, and Caleb had looked at her once and jerked his head, and she had followed without asking, and for 2 hours she sat by the bed with a basin and a clean cloth, and she wiped Mr. Thorne's face, and she kept his pillow dry, and Caleb stood at the window with his arms crossed and his jaw set so hard she could see the muscle ticking. And when at last Mr. Thorne slept, Caleb picked up the silver flask from the bedside table, and he uncorked it, and he sniffed it, and his face did something Hattie had not yet seen it do. He said, very quietly, "That is not whiskey alone?" Hattie said, "What is in it?" He said, "I am no chemist, but I have smelled enough sick cattle to know turpentine, when it is mixed weak enough not to kill a man," she said. "Who fills the guests?" "Flasks," he said. "Jubal. From a cask in the bar that has a lock on it, the key hangs on a hook in my office," she said. "Who else has been in your office?" He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Peverton Hale last Tuesday came up the drive to ask after a horse he wanted to buy off me, sat in that office for 12 minutes drinking my coffee, and I left him alone in there for 2 of those minutes to go and fetch a tally book from the barn." Hattie said nothing. She wrung the cloth out in the basin. She laid it folded across Mr. Thorne's forehead. After a moment, Caleb said, "You do not have to be in this. You can walk away from this whole business right now, and I will pay you the $1 a day to mend shirts and never ask you another thing," she said. "Caleb," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am in it." He looked at her across the small lamplit room, and he nodded once, slow, and he sat down in the chair on the other side of the bed, and he opened the leather notebook on his knee, and he began, in the careful, blocky hand she now recognized, to write down everything that had happened that day, with the time and the place and the name of every person who had been near the bar between dawn and the moment Mr. Thorne had ridden out, and Hattie sat across from him with the basin in her lap, and she watched him write, and she felt the promise she had made on the train shift again under her ribs, larger this time, the way the bay mare shifted when she settled herself for the night, and she counted the floorboards in Mr. Thorne's room until the feeling passed. There were 23. Mr. Thorne recovered. Caleb paid for his train ticket home to Philadelphia personally, and refunded his stay, and walked him to the stage at dawn, and shook his hand and said only, "I am sorry, sir, and I will find the bottom of this." And Mr. Pace. Thorne, who was a decent man at heart, said, "Caleb, I have known you 11 years, and I do not blame you for 1 second of this, and I will be back next August." And Caleb did not let his face change, but Hattie, watching from the porch with a folded shawl over her arms in the cold morning, saw his shoulders drop 1 full inch when the stage pulled away. And she understood more clearly than she had understood anything in 6 weeks, how thin the rope was that this man had been walking. The new curtains went up in the dining room 3 days later. She had been right about the unbleached muslin and the green wool sashes. The room looked, in the afternoon light, off the western windows like a room in a magazine. like the kind of room a gentleman from Boston would write home about. And on the first night the new curtains hung. The guests stood in the doorway, and one of them, a banker's wife from St. Paul, said out loud, "Oh my, who has done this?" And Caleb said, from the head of the table, without looking up from his soup, "Miss Mercer has done it." And the banker's wife crossed the room directly to Hattie at the sideboard and took both her hands and said, "My dear, you have a gift." And Hattie did not know what to do with her face for a moment, and so she said, "Thank you, ma'am," and she counted the silver spoons in the sideboard drawer until the banker's wife went back to her seat. There were 14. That same week she also found, behind a stack of mildewed account books in the small office, a folded square of paper she at first took for trash, and then, on impulse, smoothed open and read, and what she read on it changed everything that was going to happen at the Wide Sky Lodge that autumn. It was a freight bill, dated June of the previous year, from a hauling company out of Cheyenne, and it itemized the delivery of 1 cast-iron stove, 2 crates of imported window glass, and 4 bolts of cotton ticking to the Wide Sky Lodge, signed for at the receiving end by 1C. Roan, with the freight charges marked "Paid in full at the point of origin" in advance, and stamped across the bottom of the bill in faded purple ink, were the words "Paid by P. Hale, Silver Pines," on behalf of recipient. Hattie sat down on the floor of the office with the freight bill in her lap, and she read it 3 times. She did not understand at first what it meant. Then slowly she did understand, and the understanding sat in her stomach like a cold stone. Pemberton Hale had been paying small freight bills on Caleb's behalf for at least 16 months. Small ones, stoves, glass ticking, the kind of bills a busy lodge owner might not think twice about, might assume had been settled out of a running account in town, might never check against his own ledger because the goods had arrived and the freight master had said paid and the matter had been closed. She did not know, sitting there on the office floor, exactly what Hale was building toward with those quiet little favors, but she knew the shape of it the way she knew the shape of the half-cut pattern on her work table. He was building a debt. He was building a paper record somewhere of having quietly carried the Wide Sky Lodge through its hard months, of having paid for its glass and its stoves and its ticking when its own owner could not, and when the moment came that he wanted to walk in and offer to buy the place out from under Caleb Roan, he was going to walk in with a stack of those little receipts and a sorrowful expression and a story about how much he had already invested as a friend, as a neighbor, and how reasonable it would be, all things considered, to formalize the matter. She folded the freight bill very carefully. She put it in her apron pocket. She finished sorting the account books. She walked at her ordinary pace, across the yard and up to her own room, and she opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and she took out the folded note Caleb had slipped under her door 3 weeks before, and she laid the freight bill flat on top of it, and she closed the lid. And then she went down to supper and she ate her stew, and she did not tell anyone what she had found. Not yet, because she did not have enough yet, and she had begun over the last few weeks to understand the way Caleb Roan thought, and Caleb Roan did not move on a thing until he had enough. She began. That night to look. She looked in the small office, in the back, in the storeroom now bolted shut with 2 padlocks, in the tack room, in the dusty cubby behind the bar, where the bartender kept his receipts. She looked at 5 in the morning before anyone else was up, and she looked at 10 at night after the great room had gone dark, and she looked with the calm, methodical patience of a woman who had spent 15 years finding the one dropped pin in a workroom floor of pine planks. By the end of September she had found 4 more freight bills, 2 letters of credit on a Cheyenne bank made out in Caleb's name, but signed for in a hand that was not his, and a single page torn from what looked like a private ledger, with the words W. Sky and a column of small dollar amounts, and the heading in neat copperplate advances against future purchase, and at the bottom of the page a running total of $384.60. She did not show any of it to Caleb yet. She put it all in the cedar chest under her mother's thimble, and she kept looking. The third thing went wrong on the 2nd of October, and it was not small at all. Juniper, the bay mare with the long pale scar, was found at dawn lying on her side in her stall, with her flanks heaving and a thin yellow foam at the corner of her mouth. And Jubal came running across the yard, hollering for Caleb and for Hattie both. And Hattie reached the barn first because she had been on her way out anyway with her bread and her sewing. And she dropped the basket in the doorway, and she went into the stall, and she knelt down in the straw beside the mare's head, and she put both her hands on the long scarred face, and she said, "Easy, easy, easy. Sweetheart, I am here." Caleb came in behind her at a dead run. He looked at the mare. He looked at the half-empty bucket of grain in the corner of the stall. He picked the bucket up, and he sniffed it once, and he set it down very slowly, and he said, "Somebody put something in her feed." Hattie said, "What?" He said, "I do not know yet. It is not strychnine. She would already be dead. It is something slower, something meant to look like a colic," Hattie said. "Can we save her?" Caleb was already moving. He said, "Ride for Doc Pritchard in town. Jubal, take the fast horse. Do not stop for anything. Tell him bay mare, 6 years old, suspected poisoning in the grain. Tell him to bring everything he has. Go." Jubal was gone before the sentence was finished. Caleb knelt down on the other side of the mare's head, and he laid his big hand flat against her neck, and he said, very low, "Hold on, girl. Hold on, you. Hold on." Hattie kept her palms pressed to the scarred cheekbone, and she began to hum the old song about the river in Tennessee, very softly, and the mare's eye, which had been rolling white, steadied on her face and held there. They knelt like that on either side of the mare's head for an hour and 20 minutes, and Caleb did not move, and Hattie did not stop humming. And when Doc Pritchard finally came rattling up the drive in his buggy with Jubal whipping the horse alongside, the doctor took one look at the mare and at the grain bucket, and he opened his black bag, and he went to work without a word, and what he poured down Juniper's throat through a long rubber tube was something the color of strong tea that smelled of charcoal and molasses. And an hour after that the mare lifted her head off the straw of her own accord and looked at Hattie and let out a long, shuddering breath, and Doc Pritchard sat back on his heels and wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and said, "Somebody salted that grain with a tincture of white snickerroot, Caleb. Not enough to kill her outright, enough to make her sick for a week, and maybe lose the use of her hindquarters if she pulled through at all. Whoever did it knew exactly what he was doing, and exactly how much to use." Caleb said, "Who in this valley knows that?" Doc Pritchard looked up at him. He said, "You do? I do. Old man Henley up at the Forks does. And Pemberton Hales, stockman, that fellow Briggs, was a horse doctor in Missouri before he came west. And there is not a poison in a meadow he does not know by name." Caleb did not say anything. He stood up. He walked out of the stall and across the barn and out into the yard, and Hattie heard him stop in the middle of the yard, and she heard him do something she had not heard him do in 6 weeks, which was take in one long breath and let it out as a single low sound that was not quite a word and not quite a curse. And then she heard his bootsteps go on across the gravel toward the house. She stayed in the stall. She kept her hands on Juniper's face. She kept humming. When the mare was finally standing again, swaying but standing, with her muzzle pressed into the hollow of Hattie's shoulder, Hattie walked out of the barn into the cold, bright noon, and she went directly across the yard and up the back stairs to her room. And she opened the cedar chest, and she took out every paper she had hidden there over the last 5 weeks, the freight bills, the letters of credit, the torn ledger page, Caleb's first folded note, and she carried the whole stack downstairs and through the great room to the door of the small office. Caleb was sitting at the desk with the leather notebook open in front of him and his face in his hands. He looked up. She set the stack of papers down on the desk in front of him. She said, "I have enough." He did not ask her what she meant. He looked at the papers. He read the top freight bill, and then the next, and then the next, and his face, which had been gray, went slowly the color of cold iron. He read the torn ledger page twice. He read the letters of credit. He looked up at her. He said, "Where?" She said, "Behind the account books in the cabinet, in a tin in the storeroom rafters, folded into the lining of the green wool. I took off the head chairs." He has been laying these in this building for over a year, Caleb, small enough that you would not have looked, in places where, if anyone ever did look, the story would be that you had asked him for the help, and then forgotten the debts. He has been building a record. He has been building it slowly, and then he put turpentine in a flask and white snake root in a feed bucket, and he is escalating because he is tired of waiting. Caleb sat very still for a long moment. Then he said, "You found all of this, and you did not tell me," she said. "I did not have enough yet. You taught me that." He looked at her, then the way he had looked at her at the bottom of the curtain ladder, like he was reading the smallest print he had ever read, and he said very quietly, "Hattie Mercer, who taught you to think like this?" She said, "My mother. She was the bookkeeper as much as she was the seamstress. She used to say a torn seam shows you where the strain was. I have been looking for where the strain was." He almost smiled. He did not quite. He gathered the papers into a neat stack, and he put them inside the leather notebook. And he put the notebook inside the inner pocket of his coat. He said, "I am going to ride to town this afternoon and put every one of these in the safe at the bank in Sheridan, in an envelope addressed to the sheriff of this county, to be opened on my instruction, or in the event of my death. Then I am going to come home and we are going to wait," she said. "Wait for what?" he said. "For him to come back up that drive smiling, because he will. And when he does, I want him in this room with witnesses, and I want him to talk." He did ride that afternoon. He was gone 3 days. Hattie ran the lodge in his absence with a quiet competence that surprised no one in the building except, perhaps, herself. And when Caleb rode back into the yard at dusk, on the 3rd day she was on the porch with a lamp in her hand, because she had heard the hoofbeats from a quarter-mile out. And he came up the porch steps with his hat in his hand, and he stopped in front of her, and he said, "It is done. The envelope is in the bank. The sheriff has been informed it exists. Now we wait." And she said, "Supper is keeping warm in the oven." And he said, "Thank you, Hattie." And he went inside, and she stood on the porch a moment longer with the lamp in her hand, and she watched her breath fog in the cold air, because the first hard frost had come down off the bighorns the night before, and she counted the stars over the ridge, until she could go back inside without her face giving anything away. There were too many to count. In the end, she gave up at 40. The last week of waiting was the longest week of Hattie Mercer's life. She mended, she cooked. She walked Juniper in slow, careful circles around the corral in the mornings, the mare's head low against her shoulder, the mare's slow breath warm on her collarbone. She rehung a porch rail Silas Ord had pried loose and reset with new nails. She baked 4 pies for a hunting party out of Denver, who had booked in for the 2nd week of October, and who tipped Bo the cook $5 apiece on their last morning, and rode out praising the wide sky to the sky. She wrote in her own slow, careful hand at the table by her window at night a letter to a fabric house in Chicago asking about prices on heavy storm-rated canvas for awnings, because Caleb had mentioned over coffee one morning that the porch awning needed replacing, to price it out and present him with a plan. She did not let herself think about the promise she had made on the train. She did not let herself notice that Caleb had begun in the last 2 weeks to pour her coffee without being asked, the same way he poured his own, with a single dollop of cream and no sugar every morning without a word, as though he had been watching how she took it and had filed the information away. She did not let herself notice that Jubal had begun to call her ma'am with the same tone he used when he spoke to his own mother in his letters home. She did not let herself notice that Silas Ord had taken to tipping his hat to her every single time she walked past him in the yard, a slow, deliberate 2-finger lift, and that Bo the cook had started saving her the heel of the bread on baking days because she had once mentioned, in passing, that she liked the crust best. She did not let herself notice any of it. She counted instead. She counted the stitches in a hem. She counted the boards in the porch. She counted the breaths of the bay mare against her shoulder. She counted and counted and did not cry. The blizzard came in on the night of the 17th of October, and it came in the way Wyoming storms come in when the year has decided to turn, which is to say, with no warning at all. The afternoon had been bright and cold and almost windless. The hunting party from Boston, 43 people including wives and a dozen paid guides and 2 photographers and a journalist from a New York magazine, had ridden out at noon for a long ride up to the overlook above Cedar Creek to watch the elk come down to water at sunset. And they had ridden back into the yard at 4:30 with the temperature already dropping fast and the western sky the color of wet slate, and by the time the last horse was unsaddled, the first hard pellets of ice were ticking against the windows of the great room. By 6 the wind was screaming. By 6:30 the lights in town 9 miles down the valley had gone out, and Caleb had sent Jubal and 2 of the older hands out into the yard with axes to clear the cottonwood limbs that had begun to come down across the back fence. By 6:45 the great cottonwood by the generator shed at the back of the lodge had come down across the shed itself with a sound like a freight train hitting a wall, and the lights inside the lodge had gone with it, and the heating boiler in the basement had gone with it. And the wind through the broken shed had begun to drive snow sideways through the gaps in the upper windows of the great room where the storm shutters had not yet been latched, because nobody had thought, in the bright still noon, that storm shutters would be needed before dark. And the 43 guests in their borrowed evening wool turned toward each other in the dark and began almost in unison to scream. And Caleb Brown, 6 feet and 4 inches of weathered silence, was halfway across the great room with a kerosene lantern in his fist when Hattie Mercer simply stepped past him toward the screaming and lifted both her hands and began to give orders. She told the bartender to move every guest to the south wall, away from the broken upper windows, against the inside chimney stones that were still holding the heat of the afternoon fire. She told Bo to bring every blanket from the laundry room and every quilt from the linen press on the second floor, and she told him to bring the heavy stack of unbleached muslin she had set aside for the new curtains, and to bring it now. She told 2 of the hands to climb up on the great room tables with her own quilts and nail them across the broken upper windows, hammer and tacks. Fast. Do not be neat. Just stop the wind. She told the journalist from New York, who was a small, wiry man who looked like he had never used his hands for anything in his life, to take charge of counting heads, count to 43, count them 3 times, tell me if you ever come up short. She told the bartender to break out every bottle of brandy under the bar and to pour 1 finger into every cup he could find. Hot water from the kitchen kettle on top. 1 to every guest starting with the oldest. She told the sobbing woman in pearls, whose name turned out to be Mrs. Ainsley, to breathe with her, in for 4, out for 6, and she put both her hands on Mrs. Ainsley's shoulders, and she breathed with her until the woman's chest stopped heaving and her eyes focused, and then Hattie said, "You are going to help me now? You are going to walk down this line of frightened ladies, and you are going to take each one's hand, and you are going to tell her your name. And you are going to keep doing that until I tell you to stop. Do you understand me?" And Mrs. Ainsley, with mascara running in 2 black lines down her cheeks, nodded and turned and walked down the line and began, in a shaking voice that grew stronger with every name, to take the hand of every woman against the south wall. Caleb stood in the middle of the great room with the lantern in his fist, and he watched her. He did not interrupt her once. He did not give a single order of his own for 15 minutes. He simply stood and watched her. And then when she turned to look at him, he crossed the room in 4 strides, and he said low, "What do you need from me?" She said, "The storm shutters on the upper windows. Can you get to them from outside?" He said, "Yes," she said. "Take Silas and Bo and the longest ladder we have and latch every one of them. Start at the north end where the wind is hitting hardest. I will keep the inside warm, he said. The boiler is gone, she said. I know. We are going to bank up the great hearth and the dining room, hearth and the kitchen stove, and we are going to bring every guest into the great room and the dining room, and we are going to seal off every other room in this building with quilts across the doorways, and we are going to make this lodge into 2 warm rooms instead of 20 cold ones, and we are going to do it inside of an hour. He looked at her 1 beat longer. He said, "All right, Hattie." He turned and he went out into the storm with Silas and Bo and the long ladder, and she heard the wind take the breath out of them as the door opened, and she heard it slam shut behind them. And then she turned back to the great room full of frightened people, and she went to work. By 9 o'clock that night, every storm shutter on the upper floor was latched. Every broken pane in the great room was covered with a doubled quilt nailed flat against the frame. Every guest was wrapped in a blanket and sitting on the floor against the warm stones of the inside chimney, with a tin cup of hot brandy in their hands. Every bedroom on the 2nd floor was sealed off with a heavy quilt tacked across the doorway. The dining room hearth and the great room hearth were both roaring, banked high with dry split pine that Jubal and 2 of the hands had wheelbarrowed up from the woodshed before the worst of the wind hit. And Bo was running a kettle of beef broth on the kitchen stove and ladling it out into mugs as fast as he could refill it. The journalist from New York had counted heads 4 times and reported each time 43. Mrs. Ainsley had learned the name of every woman in the lodge and had begun of her own initiative to learn the names of all the men. Hattie was on her knees at the great hearth feeding pine into the fire, and she did not notice for a long moment that the great room had gone quiet behind her, until she turned her head and saw that every single guest, all 43 of them, was watching her. Mrs. Ainsley stood up. She walked across the room. She knelt down beside Hattie on the hearthstones, and she took Hattie's hand in both of her own, and she said, "My dear, what is your name?" Hattie said, "Hattie Mercer, ma'am." "Ainsley," said Miss Mercer, "when we are home in Boston next month, I am going to tell this story at every dinner table I sit at for the rest of my life. And I want you to know that my husband, who is presently asleep against that chimney over there because you put brandy in him, is the senior partner of the largest dry goods house in New England. And there is going to be a letter on your desk before Christmas, and you are going to want to open it." Hattie did not know what to do with her face. She said, "Thank you, ma'am." She counted the stones in the hearth until Mrs. Ainsley patted her hand and stood up and went back to her place along the wall. There were 46. The storm blew through the night and into the next day and into the next night, and when it finally broke at dawn on the 3rd morning, the valley lay under 3 feet of fresh powder in a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the wide sky lodge stood with every one of its 43 guests warm and fed and unharmed, and not one window broken that had not already been broken on the first night, and the bay mare in the corral barn, standing at her half door with her muzzle pressed against the wood, waiting for Hattie to come with the bread. Caleb did not say anything to Hattie that whole first day after the storm. He worked alongside the hands to dig out the yard and the barn and the road down to the gate. He thanked the guests one by one as they came out into the bright cold to see the snow. He saw the journalist from New York scribbling in a notebook on the porch, and he did not interrupt him. He saw Mr. Ainsley sit down at the long table in the dining room and write out a check for a sum that Hattie, passing with a stack of clean towels, glimpsed sideways and almost dropped the towels because the check was made out to the Wide Sky Lodge, and it was for $2,000. Ainsley looked up and saw her see it, and he said gently, "Miss Mercer, this is a thank you, not a tip. I have stayed in lodges from Scotland to Bavaria, and I have never been kept alive by anyone the way your house kept us alive these 3 days. Tell Mr. Roan I said so." She nodded. She carried the towels upstairs. She sat down on the edge of her bed, and she counted the boards in the floor until her hands stopped shaking. There were still 14. Pemberton Hale came up the drive on his tall gray gelding at noon on the 4th day, with his sandy mustache freshly trimmed and his dove-gray coat brushed and his hat already in his hand before he was off the horse, and he came up the porch steps with a smile so wide it looked painted on, and he said, "Caleb, my dear man, I came as soon as the road was passable. I have been beside myself with worry. I heard from my foreman that you had a house full of guests when the storm hit. Please tell me everyone is all right. Please tell me there has not been a tragedy." Caleb was standing on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets, and he did not move. He said, "Everyone is all right, Pemberton. Come inside out of the cold." Hale came inside. The great room was full of guests packing for the stage that was finally coming up from town that afternoon, and Hattie was at the foot of the staircase with a basket of folded shawls, and Mrs. Ainsley was at the long table writing addresses on 3 calling cards she meant to leave with Hattie, and the journalist from New York was leaning against the bar interviewing Silas Ord about the storm, and the bartender was wiping down the long oak counter with a slow, steady hand. Caleb led Pemberton Hale across the great room to the small office in the back, and as they crossed the floor Caleb caught Hattie's eye just once and tipped his chin a quarter-inch toward the office door, and she set the basket of shawls down on the bottom step of the staircase, and she walked at her ordinary pace. Caleb did not close the office door all the way. He left it open a hand's breadth, which was, Hattie understood, an invitation, and she took up a position just outside the door with a folded tablecloth in her hands, as though she were on her way somewhere with it, and she waited. Ainsley, watching from the long table, set down her pen very slowly. The journalist from New York looked up from his interview with Silas Ord, and Silas Ord, without changing the expression on his face by so much as a flicker, said something low to the journalist, and the journalist closed his notebook and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat, and turned, casually, so that his ear was angled toward the office door. Inside the office, Pemberton Hale was already talking. He was saying, "My dear Caleb, I am so relieved, so deeply relieved, and yet I must say, as a friend, as a neighbor, that this storm has only confirmed what I have been saying to you for over a year now. This lodge is too much for one man. The building is too old. You have been carrying this place on your back, and your back is not going to hold forever, and I am here today because I have a number for you, a real number, a generous number, and I am prepared to write you a draft on the Cheyenne Bank this afternoon, before the stage leaves, for $5,000 cash, free and clear, every debt forgiven, every freight bill I have carried on your behalf wiped from the record, and you walk out of this valley a free man with money in your pocket and your dignity intact. And let me, as your friend, take this burden off you." There was a silence. Hattie, outside the door, did not breathe. Then Caleb said in the level kerosene lantern voice she had first heard 6 weeks before, "What freight bills?" "Pemberton." Hale laughed, a small, soft laugh, the laugh of a man who had been hoping someone would ask. He said, "Oh, Caleb, do not be embarrassed. We have all of us needed a hand from a neighbor at one time or another. I have the receipts in a folder at the Silver Pines, the stove last winter, the window glass, the ticking, the small advances I made on your behalf at the feed store in town when your account ran short in February. It is nothing. It is what neighbors do. Only, of course, in any sensible accounting it does add up. And as I say, $384.60 is not a fortune between friends, but it is well. It is the kind of running balance that an honest man would want to see settled before he turned down a generous offer, like the one I am putting in front of you. Do you see?" Hattie heard faintly the sound of Caleb opening the leather notebook on the desk. She heard the soft fan of paper. Caleb said, "That is a very precise number, Pemberton. $384.60. Hale said, "Well, I keep my books, Caleb. A man in business has to keep his books." Caleb said, "You keep your books in a copperplate hand on a torn page with the heading Advances Against Future Purchase." Silence. Hattie felt her own pulse in her ears. Hale said very slowly, "Where did you see that?" Caleb did not answer the question. He said instead, "You also keep, I think, a freight bill from June of last year, paid in advance from the Silver Pines on behalf of the wide sky, for a cast-iron stove I never ordered and never received, and another from August for window glass that went into your own dining room, not mine, and a third from October for ticking that when I went down to the storeroom 3 nights ago with a lamp I could not find 1 yard of, because it never came to this building, Pemberton, it went to yours, and you wrote my name on the receipt because you needed the paper trail to point at me. Did I miss any? Hale, in a voice that had gone thin around the edges, said, Caleb, I do not know what you think you have found, but I assure you, Caleb said, I also have, in a sealed envelope in the safe at the bank in Sheridan, addressed to the sheriff of this county, the original of every one of those freight bills, 2 letters of credit drawn on the Cheyenne Bank, in my name, and signed in a hand that is not mine, and a single page torn from your private ledger, that I will, if it comes to it, swear under oath I have never seen before today, and that walked into this building in your own coat pocket. Hale made a sound that was almost a word and was not quite. There was a beat. Then Hale said, his voice gone tight and high and strict to the soft courtesy, You cannot prove any of that came from me. You cannot prove a single thing. That page could have come from anywhere. That handwriting on those letters could be any clerk in Cheyenne. You have nothing but a stack of paper and a sick horse. And let me tell you something, Caleb Roan. You let that fat woman from Chicago go rooting around in your storerooms and your office, and you think you have built a case. You have built nothing. You have built yourself a noose. Because the moment I walk out of this office, I'm going to ride to town, and I'm going to tell every man at the bar at the Cottonwood Saloon that you let a hysterical spinster mend your shirts and run your numbers, and by the time the snow melts, there will not be a hunting party from Denver to Boston that will set foot in this valley. Do you hear me? I will burn this lodge down around your ears with talk alone, and I will pay you $2,000 for the ashes and consider it charity. The office went silent. Hattie, on the other side of the door, was perfectly still. The cloth in her hands had gone cold in the great room beyond. Every single person had turned toward the office door. Mrs. Ainsley was on her feet. The journalist from New York had his notebook out again and his pencil moving in a steady, soundless blur. Silas Ord had not moved, but his right hand had drifted very casually to rest on the butt of the Colt at his hip. And in the doorway of the great room, his snowy hat in his hand, having walked in through the front door 3 full minutes earlier without a single person noticing, because every person in the room had been listening to the office, stood Sheriff Tom Brennan of Sheridan County. A heavy-set man in his late 50s, with a gray mustache and a star pinned to his coat, who had come up the road that morning with the mail rider because Caleb Roan had sent word from the Sheridan Bank 4 days before the storm that he might be wanting the sheriff's company, casual-like, sometime in the next 2 weeks. Sheriff Brennan crossed the great room slowly. He came to a stop at the office door. He pushed it open with the flat of his hand. He said mildly, Pemberton, I do believe I just heard you say a number of things in front of about 50 witnesses that you are going to wish. By supper time you had not said. Pemberton Hale's face went the color of old paper. He turned. He saw the sheriff in the doorway. He saw, behind the sheriff, Mrs. Ainsley and the journalist and Silas Ord and Bo, the cook, and Jubal and the bartender, and 3 of the Boston guests, and 4 ranch hands. All of them silent, all of them looking at him, and he saw Hattie Mercer standing to one side of the doorway with the folded tablecloth. And he made one small lurching half-step toward the office window as though he might go through it, and then he stopped because there was nowhere to go, and his shoulders came down, and the smile that had not reached his eyes in 6 weeks finally slid off his face altogether, and left behind only what had been under it the whole time, which was a small, frightened man with sandy hair and damp palms who had been caught. The sheriff said, Pemberton Hale, I am placing you under arrest on suspicion of forgery, fraud, malicious poisoning of livestock, and the attempted poisoning of one Edgar Thorne of Philadelphia, and we are going to add to that list in the coming days as the United States Postal Inspector. Roan was kind enough to leave in the bank safe in Sheridan. Will you come with me peaceably? or will I be putting irons on you in front of these ladies?" Hale, in a voice gone small and querulous, said, "Peaceably, peaceably." The sheriff took him by the elbow, not hard, and walked him out of the office and across the great room and out the front door, and the bartender opened the door for them, without being asked, and the door swung shut behind them, and the lock clicked. For a long moment, nobody in the great room moved. Then Mrs. Ainsley sat down at the long table and put her face in both her hands and laughed a short, astonished laugh. And the journalist from New York said very softly, "My editor is going to give me a raise." Silas Ord, without removing his hand from the butt of his Colt, said, in his quiet creek-bed voice, "Well, and Bo the cook said Hal." And Jubal said, "Ma'am, you ma'am," and could not finish the sentence. And the bartender, very carefully, lifted down a bottle of his best bourbon from the top shelf and set out a clean glass on the oak counter, and looked across the room at Hattie and tipped his head. Hattie did not move. She was standing in the office doorway with the tablecloth still folded in her hands, and she was counting the wide pine boards across the floor of the great room, because if she did not count, she was going to do something she had promised herself on a train from Chicago in August, that she was never going to do again. And she counted them a second time to be sure, and on the second count she felt a hand come to rest, very lightly, just at the small of her back, and she knew without turning whose hand it was. Caleb said, low beside her ear, "Come outside with me a minute, Hattie." She nodded. She set the tablecloth down on the office desk. She walked beside him through the great room, and Mrs. Ainsley stood up as they passed and reached out and squeezed Hattie's hand once hard, without saying anything, and Silas Ord tipped his hat to her the slow, deliberate way he had been tipping it for 6 weeks. And Jubal, who had tears running down both his sunburned cheeks and did not seem to know it, lifted both his hands as though he wanted to applaud, and then could not figure out whether applause was the right thing, and so dropped them again. And Bo the cook simply pressed one enormous flour-dusted palm, flat against his own chest, over his heart, and bowed his head. And Hattie walked through the room with her eyes on the front door, and she did not look at any of them straight on, because if she did, the promise was going to break right there in front of every paying guest in the building. Caleb opened the door for her. They stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like clean water. The sun was high over the white valley, and the snow on the corral fence was so bright it made her eyes water. And she was grateful, very grateful, for the excuse her eyes were giving her. Caleb closed the door behind them. He did not put on his hat. He stood on the porch in his shirt-sleeves and his unbuttoned coat, with his hat in his hand, and his breath was white in the cold air, and he looked out across the yard toward the long blue line of the bighorns, and he was quiet for what felt like a long time. And Hattie counted the fence posts along the corral. "There were 19, he said finally, without turning his head. "You found that ledger page in the lining of the green wool?" she said. "Yes," he said. "When?" She said, 3 weeks ago, he said. "You sat at supper with me every night for 3 weeks, and you knew what he was building, and you did not say," she said, "I did not have enough. You told me on the night of the linen that you do not move on a thing until you have enough." He turned his head then and looked at her, and his face did the thing it had been doing for 6 weeks. The almost smile that never quite arrived, except that, this time, very slowly, it arrived. It was a small smile. It was not a wide smile. It moved the corner of his mouth half an inch, and it touched, just barely, the skin at the outside corner of his eye, and it stayed there. He said, "Hattie Mercer." She said, "Yes," he said, "the lodge is not failing." She said, "No, it is not." He said, "The lodge has not failed, because you walked up the drive in August with $17 and a carpet bag, and you took it on your back the way a person takes a child on her back. And I have been watching you do it for 6 weeks, and I have not said a thing because I was afraid that if I said a thing, you would put the child down and walk away." She did not answer. She could not. Just then she counted the fence posts a second time. He said, I am going to say a thing now anyway because I would rather lose you for saying it than keep you by not saying it. Do you understand the difference? She said. Yes, he said. I am not asking you to marry me. She let out the breath she had not known she was holding. He said, I am not asking you to marry me today, and I am not asking you to marry me ever if you do not want to. And I am not asking you for anything that has the shape of a bargain or a wage or a debt, because you have paid your own way in this building since the second morning you stood in it, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. He paused. He looked down at the hat in his hands, and he turned it once slowly by the brim. He said, What I am asking is simpler than that. I am asking, would you stay? Not because the snow is deep and the road is closed, not because you have nowhere else to go, because, as of the check Mr. Ainsley wrote at my long table this morning, you could go almost anywhere in this country you wanted to go, and I would put you on the stage myself, with the fare in your hand, if that was what you wanted. I'm asking, would you stay because you want to? He said it. He stopped. He waited. He did not move his hand toward her. He did not step closer. He kept his hat in his hands and his eyes on the line of the bighorns. And he waited, and Hattie Mercer stood on the porch of the Wide Sky Lodge in the cold, bright noon of the 18th of October, 1889, with the snow on the corral fence, so bright it hurt to look at, and the promise she had made to herself on a train from Chicago 7 weeks earlier came undone under her ribs. Not the way a scene comes undone, but the way a knot does when somebody patient has been working at it for a long time, without telling her, one loop at a time, until at last the whole length of the cord ran free. She did not say anything. She just reached out and took his hat out of his hands, and she set it back on his head, the way a woman sets a hat on the head of a man she has decided is hers to set hats on. And she settled the brim with both her thumbs the way she had been settling the brim of her own father's hat for him on Sunday mornings when she was a child. Who had said more words on this porch in the last 5 minutes than he had said to her in the previous 6 weeks combined, understood exactly what it meant. Yes, she said. It was almost not a word. It was barely a breath, fogged white in the cold air between them. And it could have been the wind in the eaves if the wind had been blowing, which it was not because the storm had passed. And then, because it was worth saying properly, because no one in the 31 years she had been alive on this earth had ever once stood still in front of her with his hat in his hands and waited for her to say it properly, she said, Caleb, I am going to stay. I am going to stay, not because the road is closed, and not because Mr. Ainsley wrote a check, and not because I have nowhere to go, because you are right. I could be on the stage tomorrow morning with free calling cards from Boston in my pocket and a letter of credit from a dry goods house in St. Paul waiting for me by Christmas, and I am not going to be on that stage. I am going to stay because for 6 weeks you have poured my coffee the way I take it without asking, and you have put a lock on a door and left the key on my side of it. And you have left me a note on a chair, and you have left me a note under my door, and you have not once in 43 days laid a hand on me or a word on me that I did not invite. And because the first morning I walked into that barn you watched me from a doorway for a full minute, and then you walked away quiet so as not to spoil it. And because I am 31 years old, and I weigh nearly 200 pounds, and I have buried both my parents, and I have lost my mother's shop, and I have been looked past in rooms who counted themselves my betters, and you have looked at my face since the night I walked through that door, and you have never once looked anywhere else. And a woman, Caleb, a woman knows when she is being looked at and when she is being looked past, and you have been looking at me, and I have been looking back, and I would like, if it is all the same to you, to keep looking back for as long as the looking is mutual, which I suspect on the evidence so far is going to be a long while. He did not say anything for a moment. He lifted one hand and he laid it, very lightly, against the side of her face, his palm warm against her cold cheek, his thumb just brushing the line of her jaw, and he held it there, and then he took it away. He said, "A long while suits me, Hattie," she said. "Good," he said. "Supper at 7, she said. "I know." He almost laughed. He did not quite. He opened the door of the lodge, and he stood back, and he let her go in first. And as she crossed the threshold, Mrs. Ainsley caught her eye from the long table, and Mrs. Ainsley, who was a banker's wife from St. Paul and had not been raised to wink at strangers, winked at her, and Hattie felt her face go hot, and she crossed the great room to the foot of the staircase, and she picked up the basket of folded shawls, and she carried it upstairs with her face perfectly composed, and at the top of the stairs she went into her own small room, and she shut the door, and she sat down on the edge of the iron bed, and she counted the boards in the floor. There were 14. She counted them once. She did not need to count them twice. By Christmas, the Wide Sky Lodge had 3 new bookings out of Boston, 2 out of New York, and 1 out of Philadelphia from a Mr. Edgar Thorne, who had written, in a careful hand, that he intended to bring his wife this time because she wanted to meet the woman who had kept him alive long enough to make it home, and he hoped the lodge would consider his deposit, enclosed, sufficient. By Christmas, Pemberton Hale was in the county jail in Sheridan, awaiting a January trial on 7 counts of fraud and 2 counts of malicious mischief and 1 count of attempted manslaughter. And the postal inspector out of Cheyenne had added 3 more counts of mail fraud to the stack after going through a locked cabinet in the back room at the Silver Pines that had contained, among other things, a complete second set of forged freight bills, drafts on 3 separate banks, signed in 3 different men's names, and a private journal that the inspector had read aloud from once to Sheriff Brennan over a glass of whiskey, and then locked back in his evidence trunk with the look of a man who did not intend to sleep well that night. The Silver Pines itself had been put up for receivership in the 2nd week of November, and Caleb Rohn, asked by the receiver whether he had any interest in the property, had said only, "No, that valley needs a different kind of neighbor than me," and he had recommended a young couple out of Bozeman who had been writing him for 2 years asking after work, and by the 1st of December, the new couple had moved into the Silver Pines with their 3 children and a milk cow, and they had ridden up the road to the Wide Sky on a Sunday afternoon to introduce themselves and to bring a jar of huckleberry preserves and a hand-knit scarf that the wife had made for Hattie before they had even met her. The wife said, standing in the doorway of the great room with snow in her hair and a baby on her hip. Every woman she had spoken to in town between Sheridan and Buffalo had told her that the first thing she ought to do when she got to the valley was ride up to the Wide Sky and meet the seamstress. And so here she was. Hattie took the scarf. It was a soft heather gray, the color of the bighorns at dusk in winter, and the wife had worked a small running pattern of pine boughs along the long edges of it in a darker green, and Hattie put it around her neck right there in the doorway, and she said, "Thank you, you did not have to," and the wife, whose name was Sarah, said, "Miss Mercer." "I most certainly did," and she hugged Hattie hard, with the baby between them. And the baby reached up and took hold of a strand of Hattie's hair and pulled. And Hattie laughed out loud, a short, surprised laugh. And across the great room Caleb Rohn looked up from the ledger he had been writing in at the long table, and he watched her laugh, and his whole face did something it had not done in the 11 years Silas Ord had known him, which was open. Silas, sitting at the bar with a cup of coffee, did not say anything. He just tipped his coffee cup half an inch toward Bo, the cook, who tipped his own cup back, and the 2 of them drank in silence and let the moment go by without remarking on it, because they were men who understood that some moments only stay if you do not put words on them. By the 2nd week of January, Hattie had written back to the dry goods house in St. Paul and accepted on terms of her own choosing an arrangement to act as the Western buyer for their better grade of fabrics, with a small commission on every bolt she steered into the territory and a standing line of credit she could draw on for the lodge's own needs without asking anyone's permission. She had also written back to the fabric house in Chicago about the storm-rated canvas, and 4 crates of it had come up the road on a freight wagon in the 2nd week of December, and Caleb and Silas and Jubal and 2 of the new hands had spent 3 cold, bright afternoons sewing the panels together on the floor of the dining room, with Hattie sitting cross-legged in the middle of them, directing the work. And by the 1st of January, there was a new porch awning across the entire front of the Wide Sky Lodge, dark green, double-stitched, anchored at the eaves with iron rings that Silas had forged himself in the smithy behind the corral barn. And the awning had a small embroidered patch sewn into the lower right-hand corner, not big, not where a guest would notice it without looking, that read in Hattie's own neat hand, made at the Wide Sky, October 1889. She had embroidered it herself late at night by candlelight when nobody was watching. And the first time Caleb saw it, he stood underneath it on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets for a long time without saying anything. And then he came inside, and he poured 2 cups of coffee, one with cream and no sugar, and he carried them both across the great room to the long table, and he set one down in front of her without a word, and she said, "Thank you." And he sat down opposite her, and he opened the ledger, and he went back to work. And that was all. That was how it went, that whole winter small things. The coffee, the ledger, the chair pulled out for her at supper without anyone making a show of it. The way he would come into the kitchen on a cold morning and stand with his back to the stove with his hands behind him and say, in his level lantern voice, "Hattie, there is a clear sky out, and Juniper has not been ridden in a week. Do you have an hour?" And she would go upstairs and put on the heavy wool coat he had bought her in Sheridan in November, without telling her, the one in the cedar chest that had appeared one afternoon with a small note that read only, "For the cold, it is not a gift, it is a tool. Do not argue." And she would come back down, and they would saddle Juniper and the big buckskin Caleb rode, and they would go up the long, slow trail behind the lodge to the rim of the bowl above the valley. And they would sit their horses at the top in the cold, bright sun and look down at the smoking chimneys of the Wide Sky and not say anything for an hour at a time, and ride back down, and that would be the whole of the conversation. And Hattie would feel on the ride back down the promise she had made to herself on the train from Chicago not break exactly, but softens, the way a hard winter pond softens at the edges in the first long thaw. Juniper let Caleb put a hand on her right side for the first time in early February. Hattie was in the stall with her, brushing her down after the ride, and Caleb came in through the side door with the bridle over his shoulder, and he stopped just inside, the way he always stopped, and Hattie said without turning, "Come up on her right side, Caleb. Slow, she is ready." And Caleb walked very slowly around the front of the mare, and he laid his big hand flat against the long pale scar on the right cheekbone, and the mare did not flinch, did not so much as roll an eye, did not stop chewing the heel of bread Hattie had given her. And after a long moment, Caleb said, very quietly, "Well, I will be." And Hattie said, "She has been ready for 2 weeks." He looked across the mare's back at her. He said, "You have been waiting for me to ask a lot of things, Hattie," she said. "I do not mind waiting," he said. "I know you do not. That is part of why." He did not need to. He stroked the scar with the flat of his hand once more slow, and the mare leaned into him by an inch, and Caleb took his hand away and said, "Supper at 7. And Hattie said, "I know." And he went out, and Hattie pressed her forehead against Juniper's warm neck for a moment and counted the breaths the mare took until her own breath had steadied. 11. And then she went back to brushing. The trial in Sheridan in late January took 2 days. Hattie was called to the stand on the second morning, and she walked into the courtroom in the dark green wool dress she had cut and sewn for herself in December out of a remnant from the head chair sashes. The dress fitted properly across her shoulders and her hips for the first time in her adult life, because it was the first dress she had ever made for herself, with the time and the cloth to do it right. And she sat down in the witness chair, and she put her hand on the Bible, and the prosecuting attorney, a slim young man from Cheyenne with a pince-nez, asked her to describe how she had come to find the freight bills, and she answered in the plain declarative sentences she had spoken in all her life, and she did not embroider, and she did not exaggerate, and she did not look once at Pemberton Hale across the room. And when she was done, the young attorney said, "No further questions, Your Honor." And the judge said, Mr. Hale's counsel, your witness, and Mr. Hale's counsel, a heavy, florid man out of Denver, stood up and looked at Hattie for a long moment, and then sat back down and said, "No questions, Your Honor," because there was nothing he could ask her that was going to make her smaller than the jury had already decided she was large. The jury came back in 40 minutes, guilty on all counts. The judge gave Hale 11 years at the territorial prison in Laramie, and Hale, who had not said a word in his own defense, was led out a side door of the courthouse with his hands cuffed in front of him and his sandy mustache gone gray at the edges. And Hattie watched him go and felt somewhere under her ribs, not satisfaction exactly, but the quiet closing of a door that had been left open for a long time. And she stood up out of the witness chair, and she walked back through the gate in the rail, and she sat down beside Caleb in the front row, and he did not take her hand because they were in a courtroom, and he was not that kind of man. But he shifted his knee until it just touched hers, and he left it there. And Hattie counted the slats in the railing in front of them until the judge dismissed the room. There were 22. The reporters from the Denver papers and the one from New York wrote the story in the way reporters write stories when they have been handed a finished narrative on a plate, and by the 1st of March there were small framed clippings hung behind the bar at the Wide Sky Lodge. One from the Sheridan paper, and one from the Denver Post, and one from the magazine in New York, where the wiry journalist had written 4,000 words about the storm and the seamstress and the sheriff in the doorway, and had titled the piece, in big block letters across the top, "The Woman Who Saved the Wide Sky." And the bartender had hung the clippings without asking anyone, and Hattie had walked into the great room one morning and seen them, and stopped. And Bo the cook, passing behind her with a tray, had said, in his quiet rumble, "Leave them, ma'am. They belong there." By April, the snow was off the south slopes, and the calves were dropping in the lower pasture, and a carpenter out of Buffalo, a thin, sober man named Wendell Pace, came up the road in a wagon with 2 of his sons and a load of milled lumber. And he and Caleb and the boys spent 3 weeks building a long, low addition off the back of the lodge with its own door onto a small private porch that looked east toward the Bighorns. And the addition had 4 big windows on the east wall and 2 on the south, and a wide oak work table down the middle, and a freestanding cutting table at one end with a treadle sewing machine on it that had been freighted in from Chicago in a wooden crate marked Singer Manufacturing Company. And on the door of the addition, hung at eye level on a small bronze plaque that Silas Ord had forged and engraved himself in the smithy on his own time without telling anyone, were the words "Mercer's Workroom, Wide Sky Lodge, established 1889. Caleb walked her down to the new room on the morning it was finished. He opened the door. He stood back. He said, "It is yours. The deed is in your name. I had Wendell write it in your name when he built it. This is not the lodge's room. This is your room, and if you ever want to leave this valley, you take this room with you in the only way a room can be taken, which is to say you take the title and you sell it back to me for whatever you think it is worth, and you walk out of here with the money in your pocket, and I will not say a word against it." Hattie stood in the doorway. She looked at the long oak work table and the wall of shallow drawers and the treadle machine in its iron frame and the 4 big east-facing windows full of the morning light off the Bighorns, and she counted very slowly the drawers along the north wall. There were 18. She turned around. She did not say anything. She just put both her hands flat against the front of his coat, one on each lapel, and she leaned her forehead against the center of his chest for a long, quiet moment, and Caleb Roan, 6 feet and 4 inches of weathered silence, brought one hand up and laid it on the back of her head, very lightly, the way a man lays his hand on something he is afraid of breaking, and they stood like that in the doorway of the workroom for what was probably half a minute, and felt to both of them like considerably longer. And then Hattie stepped back, and she wiped the heel of her hand once across each eye, and she said, in her ordinary voice, "I am going to need a second work table by July. The Boston bookings are too big for one." And Caleb said, "I will tell Wendell." And that was that. They were married on the 22nd of June, 1890, in the yard of the Wide Sky Lodge, under the new green awning, by a circuit judge out of Sheridan who had ridden up the day before and stayed the night in the south guest room. And the wedding was not large, because Hattie had asked that it not be, and the people who were there were the people of the lodge and the valley, and a few from beyond it. Silas Ord in a clean white shirt that Hattie had made for him, Bo the cook in a black wool coat that Hattie had let out across the shoulders the week before, Jubal in his first suit of clothes, a charcoal gray three-piece that Hattie had cut from a bolt of Boston worsted, and that fit him so well his own mother, who had come up from Cheyenne on the stage, did not at first recognize the young man waiting for her at the depot. Mrs. Ainsley and her husband down from Boston with a set of silver candlesticks and a letter of credit at the dry goods house addressed in Mr. Ainsley's own hand to Mrs. Hattie Roan, proprietress, Mercer's workroom, Sarah. From the Silver Pines with her baby on her hip and her two older children behind her in matching pinafores, Hattie had sewn them for the occasion. Sheriff Brennan in a coat that had not been brushed since the previous Christmas. The wiry journalist all the way from New York with a small leather notebook he had promised on his honor to keep closed for the duration of the ceremony. Wendell Pace and his two sons, the bartender, the postal inspector from Cheyenne who had ridden up on a hunch and stayed because the coffee was good, and Juniper, the bay mare in the corral at the back of the crowd, with her muzzle resting on the top rail of the fence and her ears forward, like she did not intend to miss any of it. Hattie wore a dress she had cut and sewn herself in a deep, warm, cream broadcloth out of the third crate from the Chicago house, with a high collar and long sleeves and a fitted waist and a wide sweeping skirt that did not pretend her hips were anywhere other than where they were, and she carried a small bouquet of late lupin and prairie sage that Jubal had cut for her at dawn from the meadow above the corral, and she walked across the yard on Silas Ord's arm, because she had no father living to walk her, and Silas had said when she had asked him 3 weeks before in the smithy, "Ma'am, I would consider it the honor of my whole life," and he had not let go of her arm for a single step of the walk across the yard, and when they reached the awning he had handed her, with grave ceremony, to Caleb, and he had stepped back and tipped his hat to her one final, slow, deliberate time, and then he had taken his place at Caleb's right shoulder as the witness. The judge said the words. Caleb said, "I will." In the level, lantern voice, Hattie said, "I will." In her plain, declarative voice, the judge pronounced them husband and wife. Caleb did not kiss her in front of the crowd because he was not that kind of man and she was not that kind of woman, but he took both her hands in both of his, and he looked down at her face for a long, quiet beat, the way he had looked at her face the night she had walked through his door with a carpet bag and $17, like he was reading the smallest print he had ever read. And then he lifted her right hand and pressed it once, briefly, to his mouth, and let it go. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, let it out together in a soft, wordless sound that was half laugh and half sigh, and Mrs. Ainsley, in the second row, frankly wept, and Sarah from the Silver Pines' baby chose that exact moment to crow out loud, a single bright triumphant sound, and the whole yard laughed, and the laugh carried across the corral, and Juniper threw her head up and let out a long ringing whinny, said out loud to nobody in particular, even the horse knows, and Silas Ord beside him said, "Hush, son," and put his hand on Jubal's shoulder and left it there. They ate supper at long tables set end to end down the length of the yard, the awning above them, and the bighorns blue and clean behind them, and Bo had cooked for 3 days, and there was elk roast and trout from the creek and new potatoes from the garden Hattie had laid out in April, and biscuits and cream gravy and a wedding cake 3 tiers high that Bo had iced himself with a steady patience. Nobody had ever suspected of his enormous floury hands, and the wiry journalist from New York stood up at the end of the meal with a glass of bourbon in his hand and said, "If the new Mrs. Roan will permit me, I would like to read one short paragraph from the piece I wrote last November, just one, because I never got it quite right and I would like to try again." And Hattie nodded, and the journalist cleared his throat and he read, in a voice that carried. When the storm came in off the high plains that night and the lamps went out and the wind came through the broken windows, and 43 of us began to scream in the dark. One woman in a worn brown dress, a woman most of us in that room had spent a week pretending not to see, stepped past the owner of the lodge and lifted her hands and gave orders. And within 20 minutes the screaming had stopped, and within an hour we were warm, and within 3 days every single one of us walked out of that lodge with our lives in our hands, because Hattie Mercer, who weighed nearly 200 pounds and had walked into that valley with $17 to her name, turned out to be the bravest person any of us had ever met. And what I wrote then, I will say better now, which is this: the Wide Sky Lodge did not survive that storm because of its timbers or its chimneys or its owner, fine man though he is. The Wide Sky Lodge survived that storm because Hattie Mercer was standing in it. And I would like all of you to raise your glasses, please, to the new Mrs. Roan and to the bravest woman in the territory of Wyoming. The whole yard stood up, every glass went up. Bo the cook, who did not drink, raised his coffee cup. Silas Ord, who did, raised his bourbon and did not bother to hide the fact that his weathered creek bed face had gone wet down both cheeks. Caleb did not stand up. He sat in his chair beside his wife with his big hand laid across the back of her hand on the white tablecloth, and he looked up at her and he said low, just for her, to Hattie Roan, and Hattie pressed her hand under his, and she said low, just for him, to Caleb Roan, and they drank, and the yard drank with them. And somewhere out beyond the corral fence, Juniper let out a second long ringing whinny, as if she had decided this was a thing worth saying twice. By August of that year, Mercer's workroom had 3 seamstresses working under Hattie, 2 young women from Cottonwood Bend who had walked up the road on their own initiative in July with their mothers behind them and their hands clasped in front of them, and had asked in voices that shook only a little whether the new Miss Roan would consider taking on an apprentice, and one older widow from Buffalo, named Mrs. Tully, who had been turning out fine work for 20 years out of a back room of her own house and had heard through Sarah at the Silver Pines that there was a workroom up the valley with east-facing windows and a Singer machine and a proprietress who paid a fair commission and did not mind a woman who preferred to work in silence. By October, there were 6 standing orders on the work table for ladies' traveling suits to be shipped east before Christmas, and a contract with the Union Pacific Railroad for 200 heavy canvas seat covers for the parlor cars on the Cheyenne line, and a small order, the one Hattie liked best of all, from the schoolteacher in Cottonwood Bend for 12 cotton pinafores for the 12 girls in her one-room schoolhouse, size to grow into. And Hattie had cut and stitched all 12 of them herself in the evenings after the day's commercial work was done, and she had charged the schoolteacher, and the schoolteacher had tried to pay more, and Hattie had said plainly, "No, ma'am, 12 girls in pinafores I cut myself is worth more to me than the money." And the schoolteacher had not argued. By the 1st of November, Caleb had finished a second edition off the back of the lodge. This one a small private parlor with its own stove and 2 deep chairs upholstered by Hattie herself in the dark green wool that had started everything. And he had not told Hattie what the parlor was for until the morning he led her into it and stood her in front of the fire and said, "This is where we sit at night, you and I. When the lodge is full and we have done our day, this is the room nobody else comes into. This is the lock on the inside of the door, and the key is on the hook by the mantel, and it belongs to you." And Hattie had taken the key off the hook, and she had held it in her palm and counted its teeth. 3, and she had hung it back on the hook because she had understood, by then, that the key being there was the whole point. They sat in that parlor on the night of the 17th of October, 1891, full year to the day after the blizzard, with the wind off the high plains rising again outside the windows, and the snow already starting to tick against the glass, and Caleb in his deep chair with a book of agricultural reports open on his knee that he was not reading, and Hattie in her deep chair with a length of cream broadcloth across her lap that she was hemming by the firelight for a christening gown, not yet announced, not yet spoken of beyond the 2 of them, for a child due in late April. The lodge behind them was full. 41 guests, 2 short of the year before, a hunting party out of Chicago, and a smaller party of geologists from Yale, and a honeymoon couple from St. Louis who had read about the wide sky in a magazine and had insisted on coming for the anniversary week. The storm shutters were latched on every upper window. The generator shed had been rebuilt in May with a stone roof and a windbreak of young cottonwoods that Jubal had planted himself.